We are now in the home stretch of what I believe is been a tremendous day of understanding and gaining perspective. To help close out our summit, we have two speakers. The first is the head of the Bush Foundation for China, Mr. David Firestein, has come all the way from Texas to come and speak with us. He has spent many years in the United States State Department, in China and other countries throughout the world. On behalf of the Bush Foundation, he is here to welcome us. To make some comments on why it is so important to continue our goal of understanding and mutual cooperation. Mr. Firestein.
Well, James, thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It is really an honor to be here with all of you discussing the most important topic of the moment, the U.S. China relationship. I want to thank James, I want to thank above all Florence Fong, Ted, the Florence Fong Family Foundation, George Lee, Consul General Wang, and other distinguished guests, and all of those who are the co-hosts of this very timely and important event. Thank you, and thanks to all the wonderful volunteers for making this event such a success. Let's give them a hand for all they did to put us together. If I may just say a few words in Chinese at the outset of my speech. Would that be okay with everybody? 差不多2个月以前，我跟 Florence 通了个电话，然后我们聊了一会儿。Florence 跟我提到了一个很有意思的事情，就是今天会有这个美中建交40周年回顾与展望高峰论坛，然后他邀请我参加今天的这个论坛，我是非常荣幸，但是第二句话呢 ，Florence 给我一个任务，就是我能否用中文发表重要讲话，致辞。然后我回答这句话呢，是跟每一次跟 Florence 回答的一句话都是一个回答，就是照办，一定会这样做。后来呢，还是那句话，计划赶不上变化。然后今天呢，发现呢，我们到了最后这个决定是我们没有同声传译的设备。因此呢，我发现如果我今天用中文跟大家交流的话，会有一部分的在场的人士可能听不懂我讲的话。因此呢，在 Florence 的这个许可下，我就决定还是用英文跟大家交流。下一次如果我们有这个适当的设备的话，我会很愿意的，而且很乐意的用中国话跟大家交流。谢谢 Florence. Let me switch over to English now. I'm so grateful for this opportunity. I have to say, when I told my friends in Texas that I would be coming to California to an event mostly populated by Californians, some of my good friends in Texas said, will you be safe there as a lone Texan, or one of the few Texans among a group of Californians? And I said yes, because everyone knows that I'm a friend of Florence Fong, and nothing bad can happen to me in California if you're a friend of Florence Fong. And it doesn't hurt that my Chinese surname is Fong, because my name is Fang Da Wei, 作为的为, and by having that last name, I think people will assume that I'm very close to Florence Fong and her family. You know, in Texas, we have a saying, don't mess with Texas. In California, you have a saying, don't mess with Florence Fong. I want to say a few words on a serious note about Florence's extraordinary contributions to the cause of building U.S. China friendship and understanding. I salute Florence's leadership. I salute her enduring contributions over many decades and her philanthropic generosity, incredible generosity, focused on building U.S. China understanding and friendship. I think few, if any, Americans in this country have done more for the cause of U.S. China friendship as private citizens than Florence Fong. And I want to salute you and ask that we all give Florence a round of applause for her tremendous contributions. In my capacity as President and CEO of the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, I also want to make one other point, and that is that Florence is enormously close to the Bush family. Florence was very close to President George H.W. Bush. She was and is a loyal supporter of the Bush family at a human level, at a friendship level. And in fact, as far as I am aware, George H.W. Bush only wrote one preface for a biography, and that was for Florence Fong's biography. And that shows you the extraordinary respect that President Bush himself and the Bush family has for Florence Fong. Florence, I am very proud and I'm very lucky to be able to call you a great friend, and frankly, my teacher as well. Thank you. I want to say a few words about a few topics that I think are very much in alignment with the content of today's discussions. I want to say a couple of words about the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations. I want to talk about President Bush's vision for the U.S. China relationship and the attributes that he brought to his stewardship from the U.S. side of this important relationship. I want to talk also about where we are today. And if I may say so, just in terms of truth in advertising, I'm going to be a little bit tougher and harsher than some of our more diplomatic guests have been here about the state of affairs and why we are in the mess that we're in today. And I think we need to tell that story and be honest about it if we're going to find a way forward to put this relationship back on track where it needs to be for the benefit of peoples of both countries. And I'll offer a few concluding thoughts as to what we can do, all of us, to make a difference and to make things better. When I finish around sunrise tomorrow, we can all go get some breakfast together. But let me say a couple of things. The Bush China Foundation, that's the short name, the Bush China Foundation was founded 2 years ago by Neil Bush with the strong support and blessing of his father, President George H.W. Bush. We are a national organization. We are one of the newer entities in the United States working on U.S. China relations. And we do things all across the country. In fact, this is my third trip to California since February, and I have a sneaking suspicion that I'll be back more and more often to see my good friend and my newer friends here in California. I want to say a word or two about how President Bush looked at the U.S.-China relationship. He was an incredible statesman, as all of us know. And I think his views about China could best be summed up in one particular quotation that he wrote in 2007. And I quote from the written words of President Bush. These are his words. "I love the Chinese people. One of my dreams for our world is that these two powerful giants, the United States and China, will continue working toward a full partnership and friendship that will bring peace and prosperity to people everywhere. Full stop. That's what President George H.W. Bush said. And I think this particular statement gives full expression to what I see as the four important attributes that President Bush brought to his stewardship of the U.S. China relationship. Number one, vision. Number two, farsightedness. Number three, steadiness. And number four, humanity. And if I were to put them in Chinese, I would say it's 设想, 远见, 稳重. And in this case, I would translate it as 人缘. Let me just say one sentence about what I mean about each of those. Vision. President Bush knew where he wanted this relationship to go. Farsightedness. He knew it would take a long time to get there. Steadiness. He knew that to achieve his vision, that we had to keep after it. We had to be persistent. We had to be consistent in the way that we pursued our policies. That's steadiness. And humanity. President Bush emphasized people and people-to-people connections and the people-to-people foundation of the U.S. China relationship that is the ballast that keeps this relationship in the long run moving in the right direction. In fact, people is the only word that appears twice in the quotation that I just cited. Now let me talk about the U.S. China relationship today. I don't think I have to spend a lot of time explaining to people here in this room that there is now a great gap between the George H.W. Bush vision for the U.S. China relationship and the prevailing thinking and mindset in a good swath of the Washington, D.C. elite. This gap manifests itself in three major ways, which I'll talk about, not in as much detail as I could, but so that you understand the challenge that we face in our country today. The three areas in which this gap between the Bush vision and the Trump vision are substance, that is the substance of our policies toward China. Number two, style, the style in which we make decisions and conduct our policy and talk about it. And number three, and this is perhaps the most fundamental and it's been referenced earlier, but I want to use a few specific examples to drive the point home. The degree to which our policymaking has become untethered from a factual basis in many cases. These three areas are the areas where we see differences today that are stark and alarming relative to the steady leadership of President Bush and all other previous presidents of both parties. Mayor Schaaf used the word misguided a number of times, and she's right, but that's putting it a little bit too lightly. We face a very profound challenge in this country. We are at risk under the leadership of President Donald Trump of going style and facts. Substance. Here are some examples of where the substance of U.S. policy toward China is not what it was before. The first point I would make, the framing of China as an enemy is a radical departure from all former U.S. presidential thinking and Washington thinking about China in the modern era post-72, post-1979. No U.S. president, not a Republican, not a Democrat, has ever said China is the enemy. But yesterday, the President of the United States said, and these are his words, quote, Chairman Xi is, quote, our enemy. President Donald Trump tweeted those words on the written record yesterday. That is an appalling statement, but more to the point, it is a dangerous statement for our nation. It's also a huge departure from all previous past practice. Number two, what we are seeing, and I'm one of the few people, frankly, that's made this point, and I've made it early and often. What we are seeing today in Washington is the greatest retreat from the principles of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush that we've seen in the modern history of the United States. We are retreating from principles of limited government, of free trade, of globalization, and even from the very concept and theory of comparative advantage. It was noted earlier by Ambassador McFall, a point that I've made for a number of months now, and that is that Donald Trump can plausibly lay claim to the dubious distinction in this national context of being America's first socialist president. Why do I say that? I'll give you two examples. Number one, as it was noted earlier by, I believe, Lyndon, just yesterday, President Trump said, our great American companies are, quote, hereby ordered to start looking for an alternative to China. Well, Mr. President, in this country, presidents don't order companies. That is not how it works in the United States of America. It works in the United States. But I'll go one step further. We have a president who is nationalizing the U.S. agricultural sector. What do I mean by that? We have a president who would rather have U.S. farmers take government handouts rather than trade their soybeans and other agricultural products in trade with China. To put it a different way, President Trump is saying essentially this: we're going to pay farmers an income they don't need with money we don't have. If that's not a very good working definition of old school socialism, I don't know what is. Now, in my judgment, the last person in this country who should ever call anyone else a socialist is Donald Trump. Now, maybe this is why Ronald Reagan's daughter, Patty Davis, said this spring publicly in two media interviews on television and on the record regarding President Trump's leadership of our nation, that her father would be, in her words, these are her words, appalled, horrified, and heartbroken. Patty Davis said her dad, Ronald Reagan, would be appalled, horrified, and heartbroken at President Trump's leadership of our nation. Now, let's talk a little bit about style. We see in current U.S. policy today an erratic lurching from one position to another, from one statement to immediately almost a contradictory statement, and fundamental contradictions in many of the comments that our current president has made about China. And here I'm limiting my comments to policy toward China and not to broader topics. There are too many examples to cite, but let me just give you four that will resonate deeply. About a week ago, President Trump referred to President Xi Jinping as a great, these are his words exactly, verbatim quote, on Twitter, a great leader who very much has the support of his people, and a good man. These are the words of President Trump about President Xi Jinping. President Trump is also on the record calling President Xi Jinping a friend, and in one instance, his best friend. Yesterday, President Trump tweeted, Chairman Xi is, quote, our enemy. That's within 6 days. That's called lurching. That's called erratic lurching from one position to another. On tariffs, President Trump has said China pays the tariffs. Complete, total, absolute falsehood. But he has said China pays the tariffs. and that it doesn't hurt Americans. A few days later, he said, actually, this could very well hurt Americans because, in fact, we're paying them, and therefore, let's postpone the tariffs from September 1st to December 15th so that we can take Christmas and Hanukkah season out of the picture. Complete contradiction within days of those statements being made. On Huawei, President Trump said, Huawei is a national security matter, and thus it is non-negotiable. The next day, he said it is a matter of trade, let's sit down and negotiate. I'm quoting him. And on the U.S. economy, and this is my favorite, I haven't heard anyone else say this particular point, or make this point. President Trump has said, and I'm paraphrasing here, these are not exact words, but I'm paraphrasing much of his commentary that is on the record, and I'm paraphrasing it accurately. He has said that China has destroyed the American economy by, quote, raping our nation and committing the greatest theft in the history of humankind. That is also his exact words. Within a couple of days of saying that, President Trump has also said our economy is stronger than it's ever been and in perfect health. So the point that I would make is that this inconsistency hurts America. And if I may be very blunt, it makes President Trump a national and global laughingstock because his own words are inconsistent with his own words. I want to talk about facts because I think that's one of the most profound challenges that we now face. I think the reason President Trump gets so much wrong about the U.S. China relationship and about China is because so much of his policy is going to be flawed. And that's what we've seen. I could give you many examples of straight up falsehoods that have been stated and articulated by the president, but let me just mention 3 points here. Number one, President Trump has stated that Chinese exports to the United States, which is to say our imports from China, totaling over $500 billion in recent years per year, that constitutes Chinese theft of American wealth. So he is stating that a freely entered into commercial arrangement and transaction, otherwise known as commerce, is theft. That's not how we define it. That statement is inaccurate. But if you believe that the very fact that we import $500 billion worth of goods from China of our own volition, as it was said earlier, no one can force you to buy something. If you believe that that is theft, then that is going to take you in a particular policy direction. So that's one. Here's another one, and probably one of the most egregious. President Trump has repeatedly stated in writing and orally, many times, 20, 30, that China is paying the tariffs. And of course, that is patently false. In fact, his own advisors have publicly disagreed with him on the record, on television, and stated he's wrong. That's not true. His own people from the White House have said that, and of course, everyone else has said it as well. Actually, Americans are paying the tariffs. And nonpartisan, serious studies that have looked at what these cost today place the average cost on the American household at about $800, soon perhaps rising to $1,000, and before the end of this year, judging the trajectory that we see in front of us, potentially costing American households $1,500 a year. And that's just the beginning, because it gets worse the longer that it goes on. Now, the notion that China is paying for these tariffs and that large amounts of Chinese money are coming into the coffers of the United States, that's false. That's not true. And that is another example of how our discourse and policy has become untethered from facts. But most fundamentally, I want to mention here an opinion that President Trump has articulated yesterday in one of those tweets that was part of the tweet storm or tweet tirade that occurred yesterday. and that we've referenced a few times. And though this is an opinion, I'm smiling as I say this, this opinion is so absurd and wrong, I'm actually going to call this opinion factually false because it is so inane. President Trump wrote yesterday these words: "We don't need China, and frankly, we'd be better off without them." Now that is an opinion, but I'm going to use the speaker's prerogative to say that that opinion is factually false. We need China. Don't you doubt it for a second. China needs us. And for a U.S. president to say that the #1 economy of the world doesn't need the #2 and soon to be #1 economy of the world is outrageous and ludicrous. And we can't mince words when we talk about this. I'm not coming at this from a partisan angle. I'm coming at this from the angle of what is factual and what is not, and what is in the interests of our country objectively by any number of measures, which I'll come back to, and what is not. It's not about partisanship. It's about smart versus dumb decisions. Now, let me say a couple of other things. With these types of views forming the basis for U.S. policy toward China, it's little wonder that things are steadily appearing to go off the rails. What's my evidentiary basis for that assessment? #1, under President Trump, the deficit with China has grown. It is now the largest it has ever been in history. So President Trump can now officially be called the deficit president. #2, the U.S. foreign trade deficit with the world in goods, merchandise, has reached a 243-year high, a record dating back to July 4th, 1776. In 243 years, we have never had a higher U.S. goods deficit, according to President Trump's Department of Commerce, mind you, than we do today. This is the highest we've ever had. #3, Americans are paying increased taxes in the guise of higher prices generated by tariffs on goods coming into the United States. That's hitting families at anywhere between $800 and $1,500 a year. You remember the tax cut of late 2017? The amount of money that Americans saved from that tax cut on average, they have now paid more than that in tariffs, tariff-generated higher prices than they got in the tax cut. So President Trump somehow believes that it's a smart idea to run for re-election, saying that I have taxed the American people and caused their daily needs to become more expensive to them. So I want to make a couple of points about this. When people ask me, or have asked me over the years, why is it that neither Democratic nor Republican presidents over the years have been able to solve what are actually really legitimate issues, real issues in the U.S. China trade relationship, the one sentence answer that I have tended to give people is this. And that's because no U.S. president, Republican or Democrat, was able to find a solution to the problem that wasn't worse than the problem in the first place. President Trump has proven my thesis. He's found a solution. The only problem is the solution is worse than the problem was in the first place, which is why we have larger deficits, higher taxes, a softening stock market, and more discussion of a recession. So I want to say this as I get to the concluding section. I have vocally opposed President Trump's policies toward China on the whole with three things in mind. #1, I oppose these policies not because they're bad for China, but because they're bad for America. That's the first point. I hold President Trump to account not because he hasn't achieved David Firestein's goals, but because he hasn't achieved his own. And that's problematic. And I criticize Donald Trump not because he's not a Democrat, but because he is not a Republican. So we all remember that President Trump said we would all get tired of winning. I don't know about you, but if this is what winning looks like for the United States of America, I am tired of winning. Now, what can we in this room do to make a difference? Standing here in the great state of California, the state that gave America Ronald Reagan, as I think about today's U.S. China relationship, I think of Reagan's most famous line. In 1981, when he was sworn in to become president, gave his inaugural address, he said exactly these words in a different time and context. He said, quote, in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. And those words ring very true to me with specific reference to current U.S. policy toward China. And in this regard, I agree with the previous speakers who stated that it's the federal government on our side that is largely artificially gumming up the works. And thus, we have a responsibility at the subnational level to do something about that. And that brings me to the last points I want to make. The subnational level of engagement between the United States and China. Subnational entities such as the Florence Fong Family Foundation, the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations, the Bay Area Council, and many myriad other organizations in California, Texas, and across the nation now have to step up and do our best to mitigate the damage that is being done through poor policy executed at the federal level. The work that all of us do to build this vital relationship has never been more important. It has never been more urgently needed. And all of us benefit from having an incredible example in the wonderful human being of Florence Fong, to look to her leadership and say, this is what we have to do as a matter of personal responsibility to get this relationship moving in the right direction here. I want to say just a couple of words by way of an illustration, not an exhaustive list, of the kind of things that the Bush China Foundation is working on now. Number one, going back a little bit, in November and December of last year, we actually were the first ones to formally propose on the public record a moratorium on further negative trade actions in the U.S. China relationship that would last, in our proposal, 100 days. We worked that idea with the administration here. We worked that idea with the Chinese government. And when the 14 people sat at that dinner table in Buenos Aires with Xi Jinping and Donald Trump and their 6 aides on each side, we had spoken with 7 of those 14 people in the days, weeks, or months prior to those 14 people sitting at that table. And we had pushed for the moratorium. And I'm happy to say that in that meeting, the only deliverable from the meeting was a 90-day moratorium on further negative trade actions. So we're trying to, quite candidly, end the trade war. When people say, David, what's your job description? I say, sentence number 1, end the trade war. That's the thing that we're working on most intensively. And we've put a lot of effort into it. A couple of other things, just to give you a flavor. We are advocating and designing, in the preliminary phases, the first ever, this is a concept that we're putting forward, the first ever U.S. China energy FTA, a U.S. China energy free trade agreement, the idea of which is to take energy out of the trade war, fast track it, and operate on the following principle. With respect to energy, we have it, They need it. Let's sell it, and let's get this done. And by the way, we can put a Texas-sized or California-sized dent in the U.S. trade deficit with China, probably to the tune of shaving at least $100 billion off the annual trade deficit just by adopting our energy FTA idea. We're also on the forefront of U.S. China infrastructure investment collaboration, looking at a pilot project in Austin to actually do the unthinkable and bring Chinese lawful and job-creating and commercially viable Chinese investment into Austin, Texas infrastructure needs in a way that's compliant with all laws and that's good for the local economy and good for the Chinese investors. We're looking into creating a major small and medium enterprise business park or industrial park that will link the small and medium-sized operators in the two economies and help generate more trade, more business activity, more prosperity, more jobs, and more paychecks for everybody. We're doing CEO training to help American and Chinese CEOs navigate the policy and political difficulties associated with the current climate and to countermand some of the artificial impediments that have been put up that are not legal or policy, but political, and we want to help with that. We've inaugurated the George H.W. Bush Awards. The first one that we gave out was on June 12th to President Jimmy Carter. We went to Atlanta and we honored President Carter with the first ever George H.W. Bush Award for statesmanship in U.S. China Relations, and he was honored to accept, and we were honored that he did accept. We're thoroughly bipartisan, and we wanted the first honoree from the Bush China Foundation to be a Democrat, to show that there has always been a bipartisan consensus about the importance of China to our nation. And through these types of initiatives, and I'll mention one other one that will resonate here in the Bay Area, we are setting up the first ever U.S.